Hello, thanks for clicking on this video from Checkmate Humanity. Do all those things that let the algorithm know that you want to see more videos from me if you do. Today, Netflix released a new series called The Sins of Our Mother. It's a limited 3-part series about the case of Lori Daybell and her 5th husband, Chad Daybell, and their conspiracy to murder 4 people, including Lori's children, Tylee and JJ, Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, and Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell. They also talk about the mysterious death of Alex Cox, Lori's brother, who's assumed to have been Chad and Lori's trigger man. As someone who has followed this case from the time Lori's children were declared missing in December of 2019, I jumped on the opportunity to watch and see if anything new would be revealed. I'll cut to the chase here and say I think it's a good series. It's worth watching for anyone who's interested in the case. I did learn some new things, but the new things were more emotional than factual and real material to the case, because the story is told mostly through Colby Ryan, Lori's first son, and the series reveals his recorded conversations with Lori after each new development in the case. In my view, that's the most riveting part of the entire series. However, my emotional response to Colby is distracted by the fact that just last week, we found out he was arrested for sexually assaulting his wife. And until we heard that, I thought he and his wife were still together and happy, but it turns out that he went to her house and they started kissing and she told him no and he continued. And she recorded him the next day admitting to that whole incident. And he was arrested and he was in jail, but charges have now been dropped, and that's the backdrop running through the mind of anyone who's watching this series. So for those of you who don't have Netflix or may not get the time to watch it soon, I'd like to give a recap of the series and talk about who was interviewed, who was an interview. And as I talk about each episode, I'll talk about the parts that were new to me as a close follower of the case. But keep in mind that I may not have followed the case as closely as some other people on social media. So it's possible that some of the stuff that's new to me wasn't new to others. But I think that a majority of the audience watching the Netflix documentary will have very little knowledge about the entire case. And the series is well put together for that kind of an audience. So also keep in mind that I won't be able to show any of the actual footage from the series because Netflix puts very tight controls on screenshotting and screen recording their content immediately after it's released. So I'll show as many still images and other footage as I can to provide a visual context. Here's a list of the people who were interviewed and weren't interviewed, because I think that noting the people who weren't interviewed is interesting as well to tell where the story is coming from. We have interviews from Justin Lum. He's one of the first reporters that broke the story of the case. We have, and has been following it ever since. He's been following it from Arizona because he really followed the Charles Vallow murder case. Colby Ryan, and to my knowledge, this is the first time we've seen him interviewed this extensively. And my thought is that probably Netflix decided we're going to do this around Colby, and he probably refrained from doing interviews while they were filming this documentary. And these kinds of documentaries can take a long time to put together and film. I'm sure a lot of the footage of their interviews with Colby and his wife had been in the can for quite some time before they actually released it. And it was also interesting to see interviews from Kelsey Ryan, because we've never really seen her interviewed per se for a series like this. Lori's mom, Janice, was also interviewed, and this is the first time we've seen Janice since the first time she did an interview while the kids were still missing, while Lori was refusing to turn the kids over. She went on with Lori's sister, Summer, early on and really defended Lori and said that she didn't think anything could happen to those children because Lori was such a great mother. The other person is Annie Cushing. She is the brother of Joe Ryan. Joe Ryan is Lori's 3rd husband. He is also incidentally dead. And many of us, I'm one of them, believe that those circumstances are suspicious. And I know that his sister, Annie Cushing, who's in the documentary, has been trying to get that case brought. And so far the DA has rejected it. We have voice-only recordings from Adam Cox, who's the brother of Lori Daybell. It's unclear to me whether those were interviews just for the Netflix documentary or taken from some other interview and used here. We also have Lori's friend from Hawaii, April Raymond. We've seen her before. She's been interviewed a number of times. We have Tylee's friend. We've seen her in videos with Tylee, but I don't think we've ever seen her interviewed before. John Matthias, who is a YouTuber, but also a forensic psychologist, and adds a lot of interesting psychological context to this. We have Chad's missionary friend who was on a mission with him for the LDS Church in New Jersey for 2 years. And he says that Chad set all kinds of baptismal records. And they also interviewed Julie Rowe. Julie Rowe has been very public from the very beginning. Julie Rowe was an author of books that Chad had published through his publishing company, Spring Creek. And so Julie has known him for quite some time. Julie was also kind of part of the community, preparing a people that believes in this notion of reincarnation and the fact that we've had past lives and that the end is coming. And she says in her interview that she believes that the end times are near and we're about to have the second coming of Jesus Christ. The people not interviewed for this were Larry and Kay Woodcock. Those are the grandparents of J.J. Vallow. Kay and Larry have made their thoughts about this entire situation known. It's clear that what the Netflix series tried to do was show this through the perspective of Colby. We didn't hear from Melanie Gibb or her husband, then boyfriend, David Warwick. Melanie Gibb was in the preliminary hearing. She was also extensively interviewed by East Idaho News right after the kids went missing. She also didn't know where the kids were, or said she didn't know where the kids were, but had also been implicated by Lori to the police as having JJ initially when he went missing. So she has an interesting role in this case. The other person they didn't interview was Zulema Pestanas. She was, at the time of Alex Cox's death, his wife, and they had just gotten married a couple of weeks before. So they used some clips from her police interview, but she was not interviewed for this series. And also Melanie and Ian Pulowski. Melanie is the niece of Lori Daybell and Alex Cox, and she had also become part of this group, preparing a people, kind of this new church that Chad was trying to build. Now that there's such a hunger for documentaries on true crime, it's really common for several documentaries to come out, and they tend to be telling the story from a particular perspective or point of view. I think the list of people interviewed shows that they were telling this story from Colby Ryan's side of things and kind of going out from there. In this case, I think launching this documentary was kind of premature, to be honest. I would have preferred to see this series come out after Lori and Chad's trial, because there isn't much new to know except the emotional reactions of the family. But they probably started production a long time ago. Thinking that the trial would be in 2022, but it kept getting pushed back because Lori was declared incompetent. Now she's been declared competent and she's out of the mental institution. So it seems like they had to make a decision whether to hold on to all of this older footage and release it after the trial, altogether after the trial, or go ahead and release it in like a season 1. And they'll probably release a new season or something after the trial. That's my assumption based on how I've seen these kinds of series roll out in recent years, but I don't know for sure. But let's get now into a little bit of a recap of the episodes and what was new to me in this. Episode 1 is really the background of Lori's life and Chad's life. And we open up with body cam footage of Charles Vallow saying, "Hey, look, my wife has locked me out of the house and she's going crazy. She's not acting like herself. She's saying that I'm a zombie and she's going to kill me because I'm Ned Snyder. I'm not me." That's the footage that opens up the series, but then they start going into Lori's past life, how, her marriage and her children, how she got married to a high school sweetheart first, how she had a second husband, and that's how she got Colby. Then she gets married to Joseph Ryan, and that's more when there was some semblance of regular family life. Colby felt like he had a real home life. And it was during this time that Lori participated in a Miss Texas pageant.
Who you are, what makes you tick. Being a good mom is very important to me, and a good wife, and a good worker, and being all those things together is not easy. So I'm basically a ticking time bomb.
She also participated in Wheel of Fortune. Then Colby starts to talk about how, after being so sweet and nice and wanting to take care of the family, Colby claims that there was sex abuse by Joe Ryan. After Colby says that he reveals to his mom when he was 8 years old that he was abused, you hear the audio of Lori talking to a small group of people, and it happens to be in Melanie Gibbs' house, where she says that she has an ex-husband who she wants to kill. She tried to find Bible passages in the Bible to justify killing him, but there she was. And then, interestingly enough, Joe Ryan does end up prematurely dying and left for 2 weeks alone, dead in a condo. Then they show Alex's stand-up comedy routine that many of us have seen, where he talks about thinking that his brother-in-law was a pedophile, so he decided to tase him in the nutsack, and he ended up getting probation instead of a handshake or a parade. When you put all of that together, when you put everything together, all of these activities and things that have been said, it really comes out to be very dark and disturbing. We're also introduced to new interview footage of Lori's mom. And, you know, she talks about how everybody loved Charles and that he was such a wonderful man. She comes out right away and says that she was wrong about what she said in her first interview. And that's very satisfying for someone like me to hear, because I was pretty angry after seeing her interview the first time. She seemed so out of touch and so defensive. And she actually says in her interview in the Netflix documentary that she will never say she knows something again that she doesn't know. And I think that's a very, very valuable lesson for anyone. They talk about now how Lori leaves Joe Ryan, and then she meets Charles, who's another father figure to Colby. And by this time, Lori also had Tylee, and Colby had talked about how much he loved Tylee and how protective he was of her. But now Lori has these 2 kids, and she meets Charles, and he wants to take care of her and these 2 kids, and so they get married. And they get married, and at first everything was great. And then Lori says that the Lord told her that they needed to start a new life in Kauai. So they moved to Kauai for 3 years, and they made some beautiful, happy memories there. And this was also after they had adopted JJ. JJ is the natural grandson of Charles's sister, Kay, but JJ's parents were not able to take care of him at that time. So he was adopted by Charles and Lori. One interesting note is that, you know, every documentary has some sort of graphics where they show kind of a background with the words on top of it. And their graphics in this are interesting because it's a circle with kind of fire around it, and then it opens up into just darkness and starlight and things like that. And to me, that refers to the portal that Chad used to say that he could open up himself to, you know, beyond the veil, to be able to talk to God and past lives, and to be an all-knowing being. He really thought of himself as a prophet, and he would open up these portals to be able to talk to Lori wherever she was when they weren't together. So I think that's what those graphics were referring to, but they never really said that. I thought that was kind of interesting. Lori had a friend in Kauai after her and Charles and the kids moved there, and April Raymond says that, and this was kind of new information, not bombshell information, but she said that Charles just was not Lori's spiritual equal in Lori's eyes, that she really wanted a spiritual dynamo to match with her. She felt herself as some kind of lifted up, emancipated being that had the ability to do incredible things, and that Charles was kind of tying her down. And then you hear audios of Lori just talking about how incredible her life is now that she's found this kind of new way of thinking, that she knows that she has been visited by the angel Moroni. Now, we later find out that it's Chad who considers himself a direct descendant of the angel Moroni, who is a revered symbol of the LDS Church. And Lori is in recordings now saying, I've had personal contact with the angel Moroni. We've had many conversations, and I can't sleep anymore because I just have so much excitement, I'm so energized. So I feel like she was starting to say, I'm not a normal human being. I don't need to sleep as much as the other person because I'm so filled with the light of Christ in Moroni. They leave Hawaii and they go back to Chandler, and that's around the time that Colby, her first son, and someone that a lot of people really thought Lori kind of treated almost like a spouse in a way, he met a girl named Kelsey, and he started focusing on this girl Kelsey, and then he started going to a non-LDS Christian church, and that made Lori very, very upset. So Colby talks about how much it hurt that there was this division now between he and his mom. And then when Colby and Kelsey got married, Tylee didn't even come to the wedding. She was on a ski trip. So who knows where that decision came from, but it was clear that this wedding wasn't endorsed by the Lori side of the family. And that's where Colby says in this interview that from that point, everything started to be a problem. And he says that she started also at that time prepping, for the end times with large amounts of dried rice and beans, and they completely stacked their basement with that. And Annie comes in at this point. Annie Cushing is Joe Ryan's sister, Tylee's aunt, and she really tried to stay in Tylee's life for as long as she could. And Annie talks about how Lori became so sad after Colby's wedding and started talking more and more about these end times, and that she sounded genuinely frightened. Like sometimes she just thinks about, driving her car off a cliff. We've heard that soundbite before, but again, it starts when you start putting it all together. You start building this case where you see that someone is preparing to do something terrible, either to herself or other people. That's also when brother Alex kind of comes into the picture, whereas he wasn't as much of a figure in the lives of Colby and Tylee and the rest of that family. He also started listening to these podcasts that Lori was listening to, and he was just as into it as she was. So he started coming around a lot more, and they noted that Lori seemed to feel happier, seemed to be more content when Alex was around now. At a certain point, they air a podcast clip from when Melanie and Lori were doing a podcast together, and truly it sounds like an SNL skit. The way the women are talking, they're like, "We are now introducing you to the rest of your lives. Sit back and enjoy." And it's kind of a weird feeling listening to that, knowing what happened after that. That's also when Lori starts going to the Preparing a People conferences, and she meets Chad because he was a main speaker at one of their big conferences. And this is where they start to show the text that Chad sent Lori later on after they had really developed their courtship, where he writes out the whole story of how he met this, woman of his dreams. And it was a text message, a long kind of story-like text message that he sent to Lori, kind of telling their story. And it's very juvenile and kind of cringy kinds of things. And those texts came out last year, and a lot of people on YouTube were talking about that, but you see some of that in Ep 1 of this documentary. This is where they start to talk about also Chad's marriage to Tammy, and how he was the quiet one, she was the more bubbly one, and they had 5 kids together in Idaho. And that's when he starts his own publishing company, Spring Creek Books. And after he's written a bunch of books about the end times and about his own near-death experiences, he starts to think of his books as scripture, and that he's the prophet, and that he's kind of trying to create a religion. And that's when Janice comes back in and says, after Lori met Chad, everything changed. And then you also hear audio from a podcast that Chad and Lori did together, and it's the same eerie feeling of, oh, look how wonderful we are. We're sitting here bestowing our blessings upon you, and they're planning a murderous rampage. It's also in this episode that April Raymond from Kauai reveals that Lori, before Charles had even died, Lori tells her friend April that Charles is now a zombie. He's a demon, and he's been taken over by a spirit called Ned Schneider, even though he's also called Nick Schneider and 2 other people. And they were just waiting for this demon to die. So, it's interesting because anyone could read from that two different things. They're actually waiting for the person of Charles with the embodiment of Ned Schneider to die, or they're waiting for that spirit to be basically exorcised from him. So Chad and Lori are good at keeping things real murky like that. You could read it both ways. And that to me tells me that even though Lori wants to try to claim incompetence, that she had consciousness of guilt. She knew what was right and wrong. She knew what to hide from the people she was talking to, and she knew what it would mean if she was brutally honest about what she and Chad were planning. It was around this time when she was real deep into the preparing, and they were back from Hawaii, and she had been going to these conferences, and she told her friend April Raymond these things. Then she calls Colby and says to Colby that Charles is having an affair. And when Colby calls Charles basically says she's out of her mind. She's doing all this stuff. I'm worried about her. And Colby says he acted like he was guilty. He acted like he was guilty, and he was freaking out. So essentially what Colby is saying is that they believed Lori, not Charles, even though Charles was obviously correct, right? Colby says that he just really found it annoying, so he just stopped talking to Charles. And this broke my heart. And they show Janice saying that, Charles contacted her as well, and he sent emails to the entire family, and he was saying that she's crazy and she's doing all these things. And the mother, Janice, says, everybody says they're going crazy when they're breaking up. So I just didn't buy Charles's story. And it just goes to show the ignorance that people have about mental illness, and the fact that there are people who, at a certain point, when they start to really believe their greatness, they believe themselves above other beings, and they believe themselves above the law, to the extent that they can do things that are illegal, but they think they're okay in doing it because they're justified, because they are anointed beings of Christ. So this is how people who are mentally unstable will act when they're about to do crazy things, when they might be acting out on other people because they think they're justified in doing it. But the whole family ignored Charles. They believed her that Charles was having an affair and he's just acting guilty. They went along with it, and they stopped talking to Charles, except for one of Lori's brothers, Adam, who would talk to Charles and was trying to help as well. And they aired some audio footage from that as well. Then it shows the entire body cam footage with Charles breaking into the house and finding out that all of his stuff is gone. The next day, as many people know, Charles went to the preschool where Lori was going to be dropping JJ off, and he went to her car while she was inside dropping off JJ, and he took her purse. And what he was trying to do was force her to go to the police station. So because there was a hold put on her, there was a 24-hour hold put on her for a psych evaluation. So he thought, okay, if she goes to the police station, then they'll see that there's this hold, and they will hold her and they'll evaluate her. Well, instead, she goes to the police station and cries victim and says that Charles doing all these terrible things to her. They see that this hold is being placed, but their supervisor hasn't approved it yet. So they tell her, hey, just go ahead yourself to the psych center, get yourself evaluated, and they'll let you go if they don't think you should have a hold. And so it truly is, and Annie Cushing says this in the interview in this episode, that it truly is incredible and disheartening to see how the police were intoxicated by Lori's siren song. And you know what? I did an entire video on Trauma and True Crime about this whole situation with Charles Vallow, showing how this interview went down, showing all the ins and outs of it, and my theory about how all that came down from, a broader perspective. So I'll link to that in the description below. I still find this entire situation with Charles Vallow incredibly infuriating, because if the police had listened to Charles and not Lori at that time, I believe that 3 additional people could have potentially been saved. Now, episode 2 continues with the 911 call. Alex Cox calls 911 after he shoots Charles Vallow, and this is now in July. The incident with the purse and the psych eval and everything was in January of 2019, but now we're in July of 2019. Now Lori and Charles had been separated. He was living in Houston, she was living in Arizona, but Charles would come in to town from time to time to see JJ, drop him off at school, take care of him for the weekend and whatnot. So this was the plan, and when he goes to pick up JJ for school, he gets basically gunned down by Alex Cox, Lori's brother. So Alex Cox calls 911, and we start episode 1 with this 911 call where he says he won't administer CPR, but then he, basically gets guilted into doing it by the 911 caller, and he pretends to do it. And later we hear that in the autopsy report, Charles was shot while laying down on the ground. So there was no incentive for Alex Cox to do any of this CPR that he was pretending to do during the 911 call. Then after the 911 call is placed, there's body cam footage of the police showing up to interview Alex. He's out in front. He, tells this cockamamie story about how Charles hit him with a bat, and then he went back into his room and got a gun and came back out and shot Charles because he had been hit in the head with a bat. But then Lori returns from dropping JJ off at school. Tylee is with her. Tylee has been some of a witness to all of this, right? And in this body cam footage, you see Lori smiling, acting very calm, acting like, and her husband's just died. And Tylee's acting kind of nervous, to be honest with you. Her body language is very uncomfortable and anxious. So then they also show some of the interview from the police station that Lori, this is where Lori depicts herself as this damsel in distress, where she was afraid of Charles coming to pick up their child. So her brother Alex stayed there the night before. And you later hear in the episode that was really abnormal for Alex to stay at Lori's house. So this really seemed like a planned ambush. Alex is brought to this police station, he's questioned, and then he's let go, and they kind of closed it out as self-defense at that point, even though he called 911 43 minutes after the shooting. This is where things start to really open up in terms of Colby's experience with this whole thing, because he talks about how Lori called him and says that Charles just had a heart attack. And he's like, what? He's dead? He just has a heart attack? And then he goes to the house and he's told that actually Alex, his uncle, killed him, in self-defense. And now he's like, what? And he says that as soon as he shows up at the house, Tylee just falls into his arms and she's hysterical, crying. But Lori's just like, yeah, he was shot 2 gunshots in self-defense because he came after me and I'm the damsel in distress, even though I planned this entire ambush. So Colby's shattered by this. It was his father figure, even though he had ghosted the guy, up until that time. Then they show the texts, and these texts have come out before as well. They show the text that Lori sent to Charles Vallows' sons. And they're grown men at this point, and she basically just sends them a text saying that their father has died without any other information. And then they try to contact her for 3 hours after that, and she doesn't respond, and they're visibly getting upset. These text messages have been released before. And it's around this time in the episode where Lori tries to take action on the fact that now her husband has been killed. She tells JJ's school that he's committed suicide. So now there's 3 stories. He had told Colby there was a heart attack. Then she says it's self-defense. And then she says he's committed suicide to a whole different party. So clearly she has some... she's trying to hide things. She's trying to push a certain story. She's trying to keep people from knowing things, right? And then you hear the conversation between Lori and the insurance company when she calls and says that, she wants to make a claim because her husband was shot. So she does say that he was shot in that call. But then that's when she finds out that she's no longer the beneficiary, that Charles was smart enough to change the beneficiary from Lori to his sister Kay. And then we see text messages between Lori and Chad where they talk about this, and Chad reassures her and says, it's going to be okay, we'll figure things out. And he was just really shocking text messages that reveal they even said something about getting rid of him. This is about the time when Kelsey, Colby's wife, really starts to investigate things. She's like, I don't want anything more to do with your family. They seem to be dangerous. And she starts investigating, and she finds the podcast with Lori talking about her past lives and the warrior she has become to come and save and gather the people for the next coming. And she says, okay, well, maybe I'll go ahead now and look at the emails that Charles had been sending before he was murdered. I'm sorry, this part of the story kind of pisses me off a little bit, okay? Charles had been sending messages to the family showing that Chad and her had created a rating system. This rating system of light and dark people. And now they can see that Charles had been labeled as a zombie, basically, and that they were listed as dark people. And then you see text messages from Lori to Alex Cox, her brother. They're in on it. Remember, they're in on it. And she says, "Oh, I have bad news for you. We have more Z's." She calls them Z's, which is zombies. And she says that their brother, Adam, is a zombie. And her niece's husband, Brandon, is a zombie. Now, the thing that these people, these zombies, have in common is they're not buying this whole idea of Lori being an emancipated being and all of this stuff. They're not buying the story of Charles Vallow being killed in self-defense. So that's why they start really looking into things more. And here's where we get a little bit of context and a little bit of insight from John Matthias, the forensic psychologist. He talks about, how this numeric system made it more scientific, made it look more official, gave it this kind of cloak of authority that Chad really could know these things about these family members and their darkness and their lightness. And he's basically judging like a god who gets to live and die on this world in this life. And Julie Rowe, the author that he published, says that the last time she saw Chad, she asked about Tammy. And his eyes glazed over and talked about having a vision where Tammy gets in a car accident and that she's dark as well. And this was a little bit of a shocking revelation. I think maybe I'd heard this before, but just to hear it again, Julie says that Chad says, "I just don't think my plan can move forward until the spouses are dead." And then we see a text from Chad to Lori saying, "I'm trying to hasten her departure. Can't wait to see you." And right after these text messages, there's an assassination attempt on Tammy. So something I missed saying earlier is that there was an assassination attempt on Brandon, the soon-to-be ex-husband of Lori's niece. And now there's an assassination attempt on Tammy. She parks in her driveway, and as she parks, she gets out of the car, and someone in a mask comes up and tries to shoot her. And she thinks of it as somebody just like with a paintball gun and missed her. But it was a real assassination attempt, obviously, because the same type of assassination attempt happened with Brandon, where he pulls up in his car, he gets out of his car, he sees a window and a Jeep go down and a muzzle come out and shoot at him. So more people could have been dead through all of this scenario. After this assassination attempt on Tammy, she dies in her sleep on October 19th of 2019. And we find out later that just 2 weeks later, Lori and Chad get married in Kauai. And they don't tell anybody about it. They didn't tell any of the family about it except her brother, Alex. Then, really in quick succession, Alex Cox gets married to Zulema Pastenis, and he takes her last name. They get married in Vegas, and the next day or the day before, they're all within a day of each other, Melanie, Lori's niece, gets married to a guy named Ian, who had also kind of joined the cult, if you will. And so these people are getting married in quick succession, and their assumption was that on July 22nd of 2020, the world was going to end. So all these things are, ostensibly trying to happen to prepare for this end. But we don't know if it's a manufactured end that they're all bringing about, or if they actually think that this world is going to end on July 22nd. Just as a reminder, there's assassination attempts in the fall, and then Tammy dies, and then Lori and Chad get married, and then on December 11th, they exhume Tammy Daybell's body because they're suspicious. The next day is when Alex Cox dies. And you hear the 911 call from Zulema's son, who says he doesn't know the guy who's lying on the floor. He's my mother's boyfriend, but they were actually married at the time. While all this happening, Kay Woodcock is getting more and more, this is JJ's grandmother, is getting more and more and more concerned about JJ's whereabouts because she hasn't talked to him for some time. After Charles died, they had all picked up and moved to Idaho, but she hadn't been able to talk to JJ for some time, and she was very worried. So finally, on November 26th, the police show up at the door of Lori, where she's living at the time, and the people who answer the door are Alex and Chad together. and the police ask, where is JJ Vallow? And Alex and Chad look at each other, and Alex says, oh, he's with his grandmother. And the police say, well, that's funny because it's the grandmother who's called for this wellness check. So that probably set that entire group into a straight panic. And Alex and Chad point the police to where Lori was at the moment, which was she was hanging out at Melanie's house. They go to Melanie's house, and Lori says, oh, well, she's with my friend. She's with my friend in Arizona, and she's referring to Melanie Gibb. And then cops leave, and they start contacting Melanie Gibb. And by that time, Chad had called Melanie Gibb and said, hey, if the police call you, don't answer. We've told them that you have JJ. And Melanie Gibb's like, I don't have JJ. Where is JJ? Isn't he at Kay's? And he says, no. He just says they're safe. And now from that point on, the whole message that Chad and Lori were giving to the world, anybody who asked, was they're safe and they're happy. So of course, again, they're skating that line between reality and not reality, and they're saying, and in their minds, they're safe and happy because they're no longer in their zombie bodies. But in the real world where we all live, they're not safe. They're not happy. They're actually dead, and they're continuing this ruse. Finally, after all of this happens, the kids are declared officially missing on December 20th, 2019. And on January 3rd of 2020, they execute a search warrant regarding Tammy's death at Chad's house. It's around this time where we see some new footage of Chad and Lori walking through a hotel lobby with their hotel bags. Now, this footage may have been on Facebook, but I had just never seen it before. This is when Nate Easton from the East Idaho News goes to Kauai and confronts Chad and Lori as they're walking from the parking lot to wherever they were going, and we get the reaction from Colby. He says, I really did lose my mind when I saw that video, because he doesn't know where his brother and sister are. His mother is being evasive. He didn't even know that his mother had gotten married to this man, and this was even the first time he was seeing the man, Chad. And, until that time, he had been, some sort of fable to him. So when they're in Kauai, the police catch up with her. They give her an order demanding that she turn over the kids within the next 3 days. She doesn't, and so they arrest her and they extradite her. And it ends with Lori being extradited to Idaho and her mugshot. Episode 3 starts with Justin Lum in Arizona saying that all of a sudden he received a dump of, he says, I kid you not, 666 photos of Chad and Lori getting married. And then we get some insight into that famous day when Lori went to court and she was wearing her orange and white stripes. She's looking very smug and very self-confident. And we get Colby's entire narration through that scenario. And honestly, I think this was among the most riveting scenes for me, because a lot of us couldn't have seen all of these things happening in real time. But Colby and Kelsey and Kay and Larry and these other people are all in court. And when Lori's brought in, she only turns around to look at Chad. And Colby is sitting there looking at Chad saying, wow, he's cowering. He looks very scared. She pleads not guilty. She's ushered out of the courtroom. She doesn't even look at her own family as she's walking past them. So it was rather satisfying to see the kind of look that Colby turned around and gave Chad as he was walking out. It was a death stare, and I could see why Chad was cowering in the corner, although he thinks he's some sort of god. Then you start to hear more of the jail conversations between Colby and Lori, with Colby saying, you're not the same mom. And she says, really? And she says, what do you think it is that I've done? And he says that she keeps talking about the story in the Bible of Isaac and Abraham, where Abraham gets ready to kill his son because God told him to do it. But then it gets stopped in the middle because, it's a test. You're just supposed to have faith. And he was really troubled that she kept bringing up this story. And then Lori also calls her mother, Janice, from jail and, says, I could never hurt the kids. They're fine in a safe place. And And that's when Janice feels compelled to defend her in that weird interview that we saw with Lori's sister, Summer. And we're now for the first time seeing Colby's reaction to that whole thing. And he said, I just thought it was a real bad move to defend her at that point, not knowing much about it. And also April Raymond's reaction to that, which was, this is either a bunch of denial or just damage control. Janice, the mother, says during the first interview, it's impossible to brainwash Lori. And again, that shows the ignorance of some people. Anybody can be brainwashed. Anyone can be manipulated. Anyone can. If you have ever gone to a magic show and been blown away, you know that your mind can be tricked. But in the Netflix documentary, Janice finally says, and it's satisfying to hear her say, I should never say, I know again. I really didn't know, and it was a big lesson. Now, at this point in the case, in the timeline of the case, Alex is dead too. He's died on October 12th. But they have his phone, and they locate his phone with pings at Chad's home for 2.5 hours. And on that very same day, there's a text from Chad to Tammy that says, I just shot and buried a raccoon in the pet cemetery. And this is in broad daylight, and raccoons are usually nocturnal. It just sounded weird. But then when the police put together that Alex's phone was pinged in the backyard for 2.5 hours, and Chad was telling his wife this, they were able to put 2 and 2 together. They executed another search warrant and found the remains of the kids. That is also hearing the reaction from Colby about this. Because there hasn't been a trial, there's been a preliminary hearing. That preliminary hearing is shown in this episode. And we see Colby's reaction to finding the remains. And he says, I could have just died right there. And they show, the heartbreaking footage of Larry Woodcock in front of the house as the kids are found. And honestly, that will never not be heartbreaking footage.
That's to see where JJ was. And to say, I'm sorry.
We're all with you.
To me, that is among the most difficult things to watch, was this loving grandfather processing the fact that they just found the remains of his grandson in the backyard. So after showing the preliminary hearing, the rest of episode 3, which is the final episode, is really focused on the healing process starting, if it can, for Colby and Kelsey, and they show this very beautiful, touching memorial service that they do on the beach in Kauai. I'm sitting here trying to compose myself as I talk about this part. There's a very touching memorial service that Colby and Kelsey do on the beach to memorialize Charles and Tylee and JJ. And it seems clear that this may have been done with the Netflix camera crew there, because it's very well shot. It's very well put together. But in all honesty, I don't really care whether that was an idea that was put together by this production, because it was very beautiful. It was emotional, but also showed that those wounds are far from healing, for that side of the family. I do really, really appreciate that Netflix ended with a focus on the victims and talking about them and who they were, and how now the rest of the family has to move forward and talk about it with their young daughter, right? The next generation will be affected by this, and the next generations of their family will be indelibly affected by this, both biologically and psychologically. That's it for the recaps of each of the episodes. And as I said earlier, I don't think any new factual information was revealed, but it still had an emotional impact because it shows the reactions from friends and family members that we haven't seen before. And I feel an immense amount of compassion for the entire family, including Colby, but that compassion for Colby is just shaded and dampened a little bit by the fact that now he's been accused of such a heinous thing against his own wife. And when he appeared in court, his hair was bleach blonde, and he looked a lot different. And all of this tells me that he really hasn't processed this, and may never process it, and this worries me for his children and the future of this family and Lori's lineage. Please pray for all involved to find peace, and the next time something significant happens in this case, I'll cover it right here. Until then, thanks for watching. Remember to be kind, and peace out.